The State of Crypto is presented by Tron, connecting the world to the power of cryptocurrency.
Terraform Labs co-founder Do Kwon will stay in detention while he faces charges of falsifying official documents in Montenegro. This comes after a request for bail was approved and then revoked. Joining us to discuss the developments following the collapse of Terra's UST stablecoin is Campbell, Columbia Business School Adjunct Professor and former Paxos Head of Portfolio Management. Welcome, Austin.
Thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
It's wonderful to have you. You know, it's been roughly a year since Terra's implosion. Terraform Labs co-founder Daniel Shin's trial was postponed in Korea. Like I said in my intro, he's being charged of breach of duty, fraud, embezzlement. Talk to us about what you expect to see from this trial when it happens, and will it set any precedent for the crypto industry?
Well, I think the most interesting thing about this trial is there's a lot of details about the Terraform Labs situation that we still don't know. Because as you look at the narratives around this trial, there's sort of two. One is that the protocol worked as intended, right? It was risky, but it was fully documented. Why are these people being put on trial? People are just angry they lost money. The other side of things is they made a lot of representations that might have been false, some to investors, some to users, and there were significant issues with the marketing. And what will be interesting and what will likely come out in the trial is what were a lot of the private communications that Terra was having internally, what was going on between Terra and investors, and where it may have occurred, what was going on between Terra and regulators, and was there knowing malfeasance, or was this just a giant screw-up? And those are the kinds of things that often you need to see the details to really understand. That's reminiscent of a lot of the trials around 2008, for instance. And so I expect those are the important details, because the story here will change dramatically for crypto if there's direct evidence of wrongdoing versus not.
I'd love to hear your personal story. I know that you once applied for a job at Terraform Labs, but ultimately didn't take it. Tell us what happened. Why didn't you take that job?
Yeah, so I knew some of the Terraform Labs guys for quite a while. I have a couple of friends over there, and one of the unfortunate things about the situation, and probably one of the lessons for crypto in general, is that there was some very good technology behind Terraform Labs. Some of the things they did with user experience, some of the way they designed their chain and products were extremely innovative and extremely good. But when you have sort of a rotten foundation beneath it, all of that can collapse in a moment. And so I was talking with them in January of 2022 and looking at Terraform from an economic structuring, finance, regulatory policy perspective. And I had 2 long calls with Do himself, and then received some documents from them. And what I would suggest is just the details did not line up, right? Like when you were a U.S. person working in the United States and they're sending you employment agreements that pertain to other countries and other forms of law, you start asking some questions. And likewise, there were, in my mind, a decent number of concerns around the core economic understanding, representations, and willingness to be transparent that ultimately led me to say no.
You know, this story sounds eerily similar to some of the stories we've heard come out around FTX. Do you think this industry really needs to kind of take a look at how we're evaluating the firms that are getting so much money from VCs, from retail investors, who's being propped up in the media and who's not? Like, what needs to happen next? Because this isn't the first time I've heard this narrative.
Yeah, I would say, listen, sort of by background, I'm a grouchy fixed income person from traditional finance. And I think there is a lack of skepticism in the crypto space that needs to be present when you're talking to people who are handling other people's money, right? The bottom line is that is a big responsibility. And we need to start holding people to higher standards with conduct, with disclosure, with core understanding, with management of risk. And quite frankly, both companies themselves and the VC community overall have done a very poor job of evaluating these things, and it's not their core competency, right? Just like, to be fair, for people at most of the large banks in America, their core competency is not technological development.
Now, Do Kwon is sitting in Montenegro. The U.S. and South Korea are calling for his extradition. What do you expect to happen there? Do you think he'll be extradited, and to where?
So The answer to that is eventually. One of the important things to remember about his capture in Montenegro is that he is alleged to have been using falsified documents while there. So this is one of those examples of when you're in a hole, stop digging, right? So this is him committing a crime in Montenegro where he can be tried for that. So question number one is, are they going to extradite him immediately, or are they going to try him on the forged documents charge, keep him in jail in Montenegro for a while, and when he served that sentence, send him onwards? Because if it's shown he was using falsified documents, there's problem number one. Problem number two is you're going to have a competition between South Korea and the United States to get him and try him. But the problem is both of those countries will definitely extradite one way or the other. So ultimately, he's probably going to have to face justice in both places. It's just a question of sequencing. And I would say, having looked at the charges against him, South Korea has an interest because it ties in with the other cases that they've filed, obviously, as you referenced earlier. But the United States has a very comprehensive indictment against Do Kwon, alleging it kind of doesn't matter if this was a security, if it was a commodity, if it was another form of offering. We think you made false representations that apply to all of those, and we would expect you to do jail time because of it. So being honest, I think he might sit in Montenegro for a bit and then end up in South Korea and then end up in the United States. I would not want to be his lawyer right now.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think there's a general sentiment, at least in Korea, that they want him to be tried. They want him to go to the U.S. because they think that the penalty will be way harsher there than in Korea, which is interesting. But moving on from Do Kwon, I want to talk about stablecoins. So, that's another area that you've been very, well, I guess this is also a stablecoin story of a sort. But anyway, different stablecoins. You've been involved in stablecoins. You appeared in a House hearing last month about stablecoins' role in payments and the need for legislation. And, this is a really interesting topic because for a while, well, there still are multiple bills floating around Washington about stablecoins. And my understanding is that there's more to come. And for a while, the conventional wisdom was the stablecoin legislation would be the first thing to pass. It was like kind of seen as the lowest hanging fruit, and yet nothing has happened. And I, was just in Washington, and I get the impression that nothing's going to happen anytime soon. I'm just curious what your take on the current situation is with stablecoin regs in the U.S.
Yeah, so I would say specific to the U.S., the problem that we have right now is there's some substantive disagreements between the Democrats and the Republicans in the House with regard to stablecoins. I would say the number one disagreement is, should they all have to be federally regulated, or should there be a state pathway for stablecoins, either in total or at least before they get to a certain degree of size? Because I would say I think both sides are aligned in saying that something like a $2 trillion stablecoin should be federally regulated, but once you get much smaller, it's less clear. And those views are not even unique, inside of each of the parties. So it's a complicated problem to solve. I think the bigger issue, though, is that given what they have on their legislative agenda, what I have heard is that even if a bill were to pass the House, and I think McHenry is motivated to get one to the floor, the problem is this is not on the Senate's agenda for the near future, so I don't think it goes anywhere when it hits the Senate. As a result, we're left with a significant lack of clarity in the United States, and honestly, I think the big winner there is people offshore in jurisdictions with more clarity.
Yeah, that's what's sort of crazy to me because, and correct me if I'm wrong, but this is my understanding of the situation. My understanding of the situation is that, there's a handful of people who want to get a stablecoin regulation through, like McHenry, as you just said. And then there's some of the opposition, I think, and there's several Democrats who fit to this camp. They kind of want even more stablecoin regulation. Like they want it to go further. But the end result is, as you just said, nothing. So, I think that's what's crazy is that because it's kind of letting the perfect be the enemy of the good, we're just ending up with nothing. Do you see, what do you think is the soonest possible time that we could break this impasse? Because it actually, as you just said, it leaves stablecoins in a really gray area in the U.S.
Well, if the blocker turns out to be the Senate, I think one of two things will need to happen for that to change. One is you're going to need a change of administration in 2024, either to the Republicans or to a different Democrat who's more crypto-friendly, right? Because again, this view is not uniform across each of the parties. Or you're going to need a genuinely credible, rapidly scaling offshore stablecoin to emerge that threatens the U.S. system. And I would tell you, I think the latter will occur. It's just a question of timeline, because I know there are many efforts that are now emerging, given our problems in the United States, to do this abroad.
And finally, what is your outlook for Coinbase and the SEC? You know, do you just see this dragging on forever? What do you see as the sort of short-term and long-term outlook for that?
Well, I used to work with a lawyer at JP Morgan who told me every time we were dealing with something involving courts, like, take your timeline and triple it. So I would say dragging is my median expectation here. I think it's a very difficult situation for Coinbase, but I also think Coinbase has put the SEC in a very difficult situation, which is by being aggressive, filing the petition they did and trying to demand answers, you're forcing the SEC to start to put things in writing, and then their stance kind of becomes locked. And they have to defend that across the board against everybody. It's going to be a hard road for the SEC in the long run to win on the stance of Coinbase, you violated the rules, but we're not going to tell you what the rules are, and we're not totally sure what they are internally ourselves. So we may end up in sort of an indefinite timeline of like rulemaking, procedural sparring, and just stasis. Again, it just creates chaos here and forces a lot of this activity to places. I mean, Europe just passed MiCA. There are clear rules elsewhere in the world now to do this. So I think that's the problem it's creating here.
All right. Sounds like there's a long road ahead for us when it comes to regulation. Austin, thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you very much for having me.
That was Columbia Business School Adjunct Professor Austin Campbell.